times the environment affects the children's neurological development. We have seen film of some tribes in Brazil, in the forest, where everyone of the whole tribe is cross-eyed. And so when you look then at the child-rearing practices of such a tribe, you'll find the answer. So the people who got that film in Brazil, they asked the tribe, why do you not put your children on the floor to creep and crawl? And they pointed to some very dangerous insects that were also crawling on the floor, poisonous insects. And so they said, if we put our babies on the floor, these poisonous insects will bite them and they cannot survive. They're not old enough and big enough to survive. So therefore, the children are carried all the time, so as to keep them up off the floor. Therefore, they never have the opportunity to do push-ups like this, which is what a newborn baby does, and that develops the baby's depth perception, and that is the lack of that caused the whole tribe to be cross-eyed. Then in some further developed countries like Japan and China, the space that the people have to live in is very small. And so you'll find that they may have an area that is specific for the baby. And that keeps the baby safe out of harm's way, because they still have to cook with hot utensils and so on. And so the babies are then put into that limited area, which is enough for the baby to sit and to pull itself up, because it's surrounded by, a fence. And so they can sit and they can pull themselves up, but they do not have enough room to crawl around. And also these babies are very often carried. You'll see Chinese and Japanese mothers with their babies in front, and if they happen to have twins, then one is carried in the front and one is carried in the back. And so culturally, that is the normal accepted practice in those countries. And when we point out to them that the baby is not given enough opportunity to crawl for long areas, they don't even understand that babies need that, because they have grown up like that, their mothers, their grandmothers. But when you look at those countries, you will find that a large number of people have glasses, optical lenses, at a very young age, and they need them all their lives. So push-ups and crawling is very important part of eye development.
So the researchers went to the Amazon in Brazil, and they found that because children were being carried, that they didn't develop that the ability or the fine motor function of their eyes, and a lot of them were cross-eyed. What occurred was they were very good quite often at long vision. They were good at hunting and doing these sorts of things. But what they were not good at is things that were very close up, or the ability to adjust. Now, it's not great research, okay, so it's very superficial research, and it was more observation. They then went to the Kalahari Desert, and they compared the Amazonian tribe, compared them to the Kalahari Bushmen. And what occurred was the Kalahari Bushmen had very intricate fine needlework and painting, whereas the Amazonian tribes actually were devoid of any form of writing, and their language was very much more of an oral language. They didn't paint, and so while it was a simplistic theory, they looked into that the stage of development is very important for visual development and hand-eye coordination. That was developed back in the 1950s and 60s. But that very simplistic observation has actually now been bolstered, has been supported frequently, that developing motor function or general body coordination when a child's very young also develops visual motor function, which is your ability for your eyes to track and go in and out. So crawling on your stomach and on your hands and knees during those important first years of life is very important for visual function, and then later on intelligent communication. We frequently refer to the therapy that we teach families to do for their children as stimulation. But there's also another way, aside from doing actual physical activities for children, there's also the environment that you expose a child to. Now, there's two forms. You can have environmental enrichment, which is a very rich environment that the child has an ability to explore and seek out and interact with things. But you can also have a very deprived environment. Now, the extreme example of that, there's two. One comes from Romania, the other one comes from China. Now, in China it is the one-child policy. Now, because there is the one-child policy, a lot of couples, as soon as they become pregnant, they will actually go out into the provinces, into the villages, and they will have their baby there, where there are no records, there's no history of children, no ledgers of children being born and pregnancies and that sort of thing. What occurs is then in China, while they have the one-child policy, within Chinese culture, it's very important to have a boy. Because if you have a boy, then your lineage or the family name continues, and the children will bring up, or the children will look after the grandparents. So the child will look after the parents. Now, what happens is it means that if I have a child, a boy, then that boy and his wife, when I get old, they will look after me. That's my retirement plan. But if I have two girls, or even one girl, that girl will then go and look after her husband's parents, and not me. So it's very important for Chinese families to have a boy. So what happens is a lot of them will go out into the provinces and have the baby. If the baby is a boy, the baby's a boy, they come back to the city and they've had a boy and everything's good. But if they have a little girl, then there's a problem because they can't have another child. And what are they going to do? So in the province, what they do is they give the child up for adoption. They don't even give the child up for adoption. They give the child to an orphanage. And then there's no record of the child being born, and it's just in an orphanage. Now, these orphanages are either run by the church or some sort of Chinese religious organization, or by the government. Now, they're not exactly the best funded orphanages. So what happens is, sometimes in a cot, you'll have a couple of children, and the environment is not going to be ideal. Now, before I spoil the story, let's go to the Romanian orphanages. Same sort of things occurs, except where in China it's just little girls, in Romania it's girls and boys. Now, Romania used to be part of the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of Westerners went into Romania for the first time and discovered these orphanages. Now, there were 2 or 3 children, babies, in a cot. just like in China. Also, the quality of food that the kids were given was not great. So the children had stunted growth. Also, the children were not picked up and loved and cared for when they cried. And so, and this was even worse in Romania than it was in China, is that the children in Romania would just stop crying. They wouldn't cry anymore if they were lonely or loved. And now, lack of love can actually cause a brain injury, in the sense that the brain no longer functions and releases a lot of drugs to make you feel happy or sad. Everything kind of becomes neutral. What occurs is the children are not given a lot of toys to play with and explore and learn from. They're not really given a lot of room to move around. Sometimes they might be taken out of the cot, sometimes not. And then also what occurs is when they are in the cot, they can't roll and move very much because they've got the other kids in there with them. When the Iron Curtain fell, Westerners went into Romania and found these orphanages, and there were kids all the way from birth all the way through to teenagers that had severe developmental delay. And also when you get older, it becomes severe intellectual delay. Now, a lot of Westerners adopt these children, whether they come from China or whether they come from Romania. A lot of Westerners adopt them. And the child turns up and they bring the child back to America, and then the child's not developing as much. And they go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, your child has developmental delay. And the parents are, what's that? And they started to look at it, and that it was the environment that the children were in, that they had been deprived, environmentally deprived. Now, we've worked with some of these children, both from China and from Romania, also from, it was Uruguay. What happens is we then, when they've come from an environmentally deprived environment, we then want to enrich their environment. Now, birth to the age of 2, once again, is the primary window for neurological development, due to the abundance of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. We want to use that and harness it to help the brain learn faster. So, a couple of things we do. Let's retrace the steps and look at what we can do. The children have not been given enough room to move, both probably during the day as well as in their cot at night. So instead of having the children in a cot, let's take them out of the cot and put them on the large bed on the floor. So children can roll around when they're sleeping. Then, during the day, we want the children to crawl everywhere. We're going to do some patterning and teach them to crawl if they can't. We'll also do some activities, some patterning activities, to teach them how to move coordinated in certain coordination patterns. We'll also do a lot of activities to do with vision, but we'll enrich their environment. We get disco lights and put disco lights on the ceiling. We'll get disco balls, or we'll get Christmas lights that move and track. We'll get LED lamps or lava lamps, and all these things that children can look at. There are a couple of forms. It's very important to be able to follow something, look at something closely, as well as focus on something. So we need to give children a lot of opportunity for that. We'll help their vision. We'll play them classical music, beautiful Mozart and Haydn and Bach, so that they can listen to the intricacies of sound. We'll also make sure they have the best food possible, because once again, food can be either the world's best medicine or a very slow poison. So we give them everything organic and we supplement their food. Then, because the children don't have probably not been exposed to a lot of things to play with, we're going to give them a lot of toys that they can interact with and play with and feel, that make noises and move. Then we're going to love them as much as we can. We'll take them into the pool, and we'll take them into the beautiful warm pool where they can move and be happy and get an increased level of feedback into their body when they're moving. So what we do is we look at every single area of stimulation, and then we enrich it. We make it more powerful. We use frequency, intensity, and duration to enhance the amount of information that the child's brain is receiving. Now, through that, the children from China, Paraguay, or the Uruguay, and Romania that we have worked with have improved. Now, the ones that were younger made more improvement than the ones that were older, but all of them significantly improved. Now, what can we take from this? The environment we have our children in is very, very important, just as important as the therapy that we do. When we do therapy with them, we're going to be physically doing it to them. But then in the times in between, they are just as important as when we're actually hands-on. So we need to make sure that the environment is enriched like that so that they can really benefit. It's what we call incidental therapy, the in-between therapy. There's another example of this. Temple Fay, Doman and Delicato did some research, and they were looking into the therapy. This is in the very, very early days that they were doing therapy. And they developed therapy programs and they sent the parents home to go and do the therapy. And then they had another group, which were the control group, of kids that would attend. It was a control group. Maybe they did nothing, maybe they just attended kindergarten classes, but it was the control where they didn't receive any stimulation. Then after a period of time, after 6 months, they come back and they assess the development. And when they compare the two groups, the kids that had received no therapy actually did better than the kids that received the initial therapy that they had designed. We're talking about the first round of thoughts of therapy. Doman and Delicato significantly improved their therapy over time. And they said, well, why is this? Why have these kids developed more than these ones? And what they found out was that those children that received no therapy, they asked the parents, what are you doing with your children? And they said, well, we just took it home and put it on the floor. On the floor? And that's where the whole concept of having your child on the floor came about. That these children were exposed to the floor, whereas the other kids were up on tables and they were doing stuff with them all the time. And that's where the first ideas of retracing the developmental steps came from. These children were on the floor, which meant that they were exposed to the floor and interacted with it. Another example, and so they benefited significantly. Another example was in America, parents have, well, depending on socioeconomic levels, they have insurance, medical insurance. If you have money in America, you can afford good insurance. Now, when you come home, you have a brain injury, you come home, and parents that have really good insurance, quite often they are provided with a hospital bed, literally a hospital bed in their home. Sometimes they're given around-the-clock nursing to look after the child and supervise the child. Because the child has, the dietitians at the hospital will control its diet, so it's given formula the whole time. Okay? Everything's controlled in accordance with guidelines. The child's looked after, it's kept safe, it's not overwhelmed, it's by the book. Compare that to a lower socioeconomic family that does not have insurance. Kid comes home from hospital. Where do they put it? On the couch or on the floor with the rest of the family. And there's no nurse to look after the kid, so when mum and dad are in the kitchen, the brothers and sisters look after the child. And what are they doing? They're climbing on top of the kid and they're rolling around and they're doing everything and wrestling with them and the child's, all the children are on top of the child. And then, well, they don't have formula provided by the hospital, so what do they eat? They eat what everybody else is eating. Maybe, real food, maybe blended or mashed up or I don't know, whatever the situation is, depending on how old the child is. And what happens is they found that families of lower socioeconomic class, which basically means families that didn't compensate for their child, exposed it to the other family members, exposed it to real food, and exposed it to an environment where it could move and was challenged, the child did better. So now the environment a child's in is very, very important. Because aside from a lot of the work and therapy you're going to do, after and between, the environment will really either draw out the progress the child has made or the knowledge it has of the activities it's been taught, or if you limit your child's environment, in other words, maybe you do therapy with it and then you stick it in a pram, or you do therapy with it and then you don't let it have toys to play with, then the therapy is going to be stunted in its effectiveness. So environment that we create for our children is very, very important.